Tendons don't respond to different types of contraction. They respond to strain and stress. So they all they know is, are they being pulled on and how fast are they being pulled on?
Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast, the podcast that dives into the philosophies, ideas, and practices of some of the best practitioners in high-performance sport. If you tuned in to the Pacey Performance Podcast a few weeks ago and listened to the Keith Barr episode, which many of you did because I've had some incredible feedback, this is a really good follow-on from that episode. And if you haven't checked it out, make sure you do. It dives into the depths of training tendons for dynamic performance and for injury risk reduction as well. But in this episode with Luke Vella, again, we dive into training the tendon and why that's so important and some of the things that Luke has done at Edinburgh, but will also carry through into his new role as lead strength and conditioning coach at the Melbourne Rebels. We also have a little chat around blood flow restriction training and how that is incorporated into the rehab process that Luke goes through for many different injuries. So if you have any input into the rehab process in the organization that you work in, this episode is definitely for you. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Hawkin Dynamics. Hawkin Dynamics is the world's first wireless force plate testing system. The Hawkin Dynamics system is built for coaches to test in the real world, not just in the lab. Capture reliable data on all your athletes in a matter of minutes and monitor their progress in the cloud from anywhere in the world. The Hawkin Dynamics force plates are wireless, portable, and trusted by teams at every level of sport. Integrating force plates into your athlete monitoring program has never been easier or more affordable. If you want to see the Hawkin Dynamics force plate system in action, head over to their website, hawkindynamics.com, to schedule a demo or follow them on Twitter at Hawkin Dynamics. And this episode of the podcast is also sponsored by iMeasureU. iMeasureU is used by leading sports practitioners and biomechanics researchers worldwide to capture and compare multi-limb inertial data in the field. IMU Step from iMeasureU is a dual sensor and app lower limb load monitoring tool which helps practitioners optimize return to play for running-based sports. iMeasureU have just released their new and improved waterproof sensor Blue Trident, which includes ultra-high G capabilities to quantify high-impact steps such as cutting, landing and sprinting, longer life battery to collect data all day, real-time feedback to aid immediate interventions, and faster workflow so practitioners can review long training sessions within minutes of training completion. iMeasureU, now part of Vicon, works with military, pro and collegiate coaches and athletes from around the world, including the Australian Institute of Sport, the US Department of Defense, and collegiate and pro teams from around the world. If you want to get to know more about iMeasureU, head over to their website iMeasureU.com or follow them on Twitter or Instagram at iMeasureU. So without further ado, over to the episode with Luke Vella. Luke Vella, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. You come with an absolutely raving review from one of your ex-colleagues, Nick Lumley, so no pressure at all. But thanks for coming on.
Sounds like he stitched me up there. No, it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invite.
My pleasure. So a little bit of a transition back home, out of Edinburgh to back to Oz, and another couple of changes while you've been there already. But congratulations on your new role. Would you be able to give us a bit of a brief background on you, maybe why the transition happened back to Oz, what was happening before then in Edinburgh, and a bit of an overview.
Yeah, for sure. So I started out in Aussie Rules football with a stint at Collingwood starting in 2008, and then over to St Kilda Footy Club from 2011. Also did a little bit of work in Olympic track cycling with the Malaysian squad in the lead up to the London Olympics during that time as well. We then decided, a family decision, to move over to the UK to support my wife's career. She's the sports psychologist for the British diving team. And so I took up a role with the University of Bath, which was my first experience in a multi-sport environment, and had me working with some British judo squads tennis academy based out there, Super League Netball, and the TAS scholarship scheme. And that's what led me up to Edinburgh Rugby with Nick, and I've spent the last 4.5 years there. That was my first exposure to rugby union. In that time, we also had a little boy, Leo, and we had him during the lockdown, and he still hasn't met his grandparents yet, and so he was really the reason that we decided to move home was to get the family together again and get our young fella around his grandparents.
Nice. Is your wife, did you say?
My wife, yeah, Laura.
Yeah, your wife. I didn't want to say wife, it was your girlfriend, but yeah. So your wife is she's obviously still not involved with the British diving.
She is. So she stayed on till for the Tokyo Games, obviously that are on currently, and so it actually worked better for her to be in Australia during the games, in terms of fielding phone calls and bits and pieces like that from athletes, and so she'll be with the British divers until the end of the games. And
they've done well so far.
They have, yeah. So really a good start with the gold medal. So she's buzzing.
Nice. I'm always really interested in people that transition to jobs overseas. What was that like for you as an Aussie coming to the UK?
Yeah, it was a massive challenge, especially because the job itself was so foreign to me. In terms of there was a massive difference between being an S&C coach in a professional team sport environment where you see your athletes for 5 to 6 hours a day, into a multi-sport environment where you might be working with a group of 12-year-old football players with the Southampton Academy, and then over to a 100-kilo judo competitor, to a group of netball girls. It really challenges your ability to coach and to interact with people and interact with different coaches and solve problems, really. And so that was a massive challenge. And I've certainly found that the UK system and the Australian system, they're just different. UK-based practitioners are different to Australian-based practitioners, and it's really difficult to put your finger on how and why. But I've worked with a lot of Australians over in the UK that transitioned over, and the majority have said the same thing. It's a different system, and I think that's what makes it such a good learning experience. Is you learn from people who have had completely different educational backgrounds and different coaching experiences to what you've had. And it was a massive challenge, but I'd recommend it so highly for anyone looking to progress their career and develop themselves as a coach. It's a massive challenge, but a worthwhile one.
I hate to offend you here, but you've got a little bit of an English accent going on there as well.
I know, it got worse when I was in Bath.
Sorry.
No, it's definitely there. When I went up to Scotland, I couldn't really understand what they said a lot of the time, so I didn't really pick up much of a Scottish accent, but hopefully getting back home, that'll disappear pretty quickly.
Just one thing on that Bath role, and a lot of people, I think there's two schools of thought, of course. There's I am the rugby guy and I'm going to stick in rugby and I'm going to go deep in that sport. Or there's I appreciate that getting involved in the sports can give her a wider perspective to then narrow down when we do get a job in a given sport. Where do you stand? And has that changed based on your experience?
Yeah, that's an excellent question and a really good point at the end there. I think it has changed. I've really valued the opportunity to go into other sports and to learn or to encounter different challenges as an S&C coach and work with different coaches and figure out how to work with different athletes. I think it just gives you such a broader skill set to draw upon before really narrowing in on a certain sport. Even for me, the concept when I went to Edinburgh, rugby union was completely new to me and a completely different sport. And it probably took me the first 2 to 3 years there to understand just how intense and how physical that sport is before I felt like I was really able to do a good job. But I sit on the side of trying your hand at multiple sports and challenging yourself to be really effective as an S&C coach across different platforms.
So you were at Edinburgh in more of a rehab role, is that right?
That's right, yeah. So my background as an S&C coach, in my last year at Collingwood, I managed the rehab group, and it was more through circumstance than anything that sort of ended me in that role. And I had the same role over at St Kilda where I managed the rehab group and sort of developed myself as a bit of a rehabber through experience and grew to love the role. And as I transitioned over into the UK, the title and it sort of stuck, and so that was my reputation when Nick approached me about the job at Edinburgh, and that's just really continued to evolve over the last 4 years, and so it's really been a learn on the job type of scenario for me. My PhD and my studies weren't particularly in athlete rehabilitation, but it's certainly the way my career's been driven over the past probably 8 to 10 years.
Because we are seeing more, especially here, I'm not quite sure elsewhere in the world, but specifically here, seeing more rehab-focused job titles and job roles, probably what you had at Edinburgh, but I think that's becoming more prevalent. Is that because people are seeing it as a very much a niche skill set? Because I'm guessing probably 5 to 10 years ago, maybe people didn't have as many staff, and it just got bundled in with an S&C coach's or sports scientist role. But do you see it as a very specific skill set that should be differentiated from your general S&C coach?
I hope so, because that's kind of the role I've cut out for myself. But no, I do, and I think probably, like you say, 5-10 years ago, that the injury or the injured player programs were being managed by your junior S&C coach as an opportunity to cut your teeth as an S&C. But I think injury rates continue to go up, and we learn more and more about risk factors and rehabilitation strategies, but injuries continue to rise, and I think people are starting to understand that if you want to get on top of rates of injury within your club, you need someone with a specialist skill set and someone who's invested their time and effort into learning about different pathologies and different rehab strategies and these other bits and pieces. And so I think that's becoming more and more accepted, and that was certainly something that Nick tried to change up at Edinburgh in how he structured his department, and fortunately for me that landed me up there.
I actually spoke to Nick in preparation for this, just a couple of texts back and forth, and was like, what's Luke's, like, where's his skill set? What is he really good at? What does he absolutely nail? So I don't know if I told you this, but the points that we've got were kind of a collaboration between myself and Nick, obviously, who worked alongside you for a while and knows you very well. So we're going to have a little dive into tendon management, if that's all right. And it was
absolutely fine.
It was something that I spoke very much in depth to Keith Barr about, obviously a bit of a legend in that area. And the episode absolutely blew up. People loved it. Didn't realise how mad people were for tendons. Like, you're crazy. Yeah, people went mad for it. So I'm just going to ask you from a very much an applied view of that discussion, if that's okay. And then let's start off with tips for managing tendon health, and just get your view on that, and then I'm sure the conversation will fly off from there.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I've obviously listened to Keith's podcast, and his wealth of knowledge is exceptional in that area. And there's a real sort of development of our knowledge in tendon management at the moment, being led by people like Keith. And there's another researcher down in at Queen Mary University of London, Professor Hazel Screen. She's a professor of biomedical engineering. And these types of researchers who are really driven by a scientific background are really advancing our knowledge in how we manage tendons. And it's a really exciting time to be involved in that area. In terms of managing tendons from a professional team sport perspective, I think it's really important to actually appreciate firstly what we don't know about tendons, and that helps to inform what we actually can influence and what we can impact on, because we really don't know a lot still. We still don't really understand the source of tendon pain. We know that there's likely a local mechanism of pain stemming from the tendon itself. We know there's likely to be centrally driven mechanisms stemming from the brain and the spinal cord, but we don't really know what drives tendon pain. And we're still really starting to understand how adaptable tendons can be and how adaptable tendons are, and a lot of that stems from research from Keith's group and research from Professor Screen's group. We're starting to learn a lot more about actually just how adaptable tendons can be. And the other thing that makes tendons really difficult to manage is tendon. In a case of a tendinopathy, you can have changes in the pathology, you can have changes in how the tendon functions, and you can have changes in symptoms. And those three things can occur all independent of one another. We don't really understand how those three things are interrelated. So you can have changes in pathology without necessarily having any symptoms. You can have symptoms without having changes in function. All three of them may even coexist. And so for me, that the number one thing that needs to be, or you need to start with in trying to successfully manage a tendon, is you need to understand on an individual level the relationship between load, pain and function within each of your athletes. And that was one of the things that we invested quite a lot of time in our athletes who struggle with tendon pain at Edinburgh. So we'd effectively go through a subjective monitoring process with those players, and utilised our sports science guys and our data analytics guys to understand how those changes in symptom would be influenced by different types of load for a professional rugby player, and that certainly impacted how we managed our athletes. Both day to day and also long term. It gave us indications of how effective our strategies were being, and then I think you also need to understand concepts of how to effectively load a tendon, and Keith went into this in great detail in your previous podcast. But I think what was really important concept for me was to understand that tendons are not a contractile tissue, and so when you hear debates about the different contraction types and how do we load a tendon successfully, the contraction type doesn't matter. Tendons don't respond to different types of contraction. They respond to strain and stress. So all they know is, are they being pulled on and how fast are they being pulled on? They'll adapt accordingly. So you use different contraction types to modify how your neuromuscular system responds. And we know that changes in the neuromuscular system are essential in managing tendinopathy. And you can also use different contraction types to modify stress and strain to try and appropriately load a tendon. And so for me, there was really four key concepts that an effective loading strategy needs to be. And first of all, the loading strategy needs to be individualized. And so very rarely does tendinopathy exist in isolation. We know with, say, patellar tendon, for example, there's probably 4 or 5 differential diagnoses that might coexist or that may be misdiagnosed. And so you need to develop an individualized loading strategy based on how provocative the tendon is and how provocative other structures around the tendon are. The second thing you need to consider is that it needs to be really hard. And so we know from lots of different research and systematic analysis from Peter Malliaris's group at Monash University that it needs to be at least a 70% of a 1 repetition max if you're talking about the intensity of loading. We also know that the exercises that you select should be really simple. So tendons have a real knack of hiding within a kinetic chain. So really simple exercises that will load the target muscle and load the tendon effectively will be really important. And then the final one to consider is that it needs to be intensive. So really bringing those last two concepts together, you need to give the athlete an opportunity to produce high amounts of force to load the tendon effectively. So for example, if you're using an isometric contraction, you need to be choosing muscle lengths at which the muscle has an opportunity to produce high amounts of force, and that can be driven by both symptoms and also the length tension relationship of that muscle.
There's loads to go out there. I'm going to rewind it right back to the start and just go symptoms. So what kind of symptoms were you seeing in your athletes who had tendon issues? Just so people can get an idea if they are going through it and try to understand what's going on. What kind of symptoms are we normally seeing?
Yeah, of course. So we looked at for someone with patellar tendon pain, we looked at 2 different tests. 3 tests effectively. We wanted to look at a subjective rating out of 10 for all of our options, and we would look at morning stiffness as one of our indicators, and that's recorded first thing in the morning. We then look at a single leg decline squat to subject the athlete to a compression load, and we then look at a repeated single leg submaximal kind of movement jump to look at subjecting them to an energy storage load. They then record that as a subjective rating out of 10, and we do that prior to all of our main training sessions. In the instance of an Achilles tendon, we'd go through the same process. So we would look at a measure of morning stiffness. We'd look at a subjective measure of discomfort under a compressive load. So that would be a single leg calf raise off a step. And then we'd look at more of a single leg hopping task, like a single leg pogo jump, and then record their subjective scores there. Yeah.
So I guess one of the other three was function. So
Mm-hmm.
what reductions in function would you see with someone with tendon? Again, going through maybe the two examples that you've just given.
Sure. Yeah. So our process effectively was, first of all, when the athlete would present to us in the morning, we'd look to identify whether there's been a change in the athlete's symptoms. And if the answer to that was no, that's the end of our monitoring with them. They'll crack on with the day's training. If the answer was yes, our next step would be to try and understand, can we modify that athlete's pain through an exercise-based intervention? So do they respond to an effective warm-up strategy, whether that's with isometric loading or whatever else we used, a blood flow restriction training protocol? And if the answer to that was no, we'd then go on to look at whether or not there'd been a reduction in muscle function. And typically for that parameter, we would look at using for a patellar tendinopathy, we'd look at a counter movement jump on our ForceDecks, and we'd look at primarily eccentric impulse, but also looking at concentric mean power. And likewise with an Achilles tendon, we look at a bilateral drop jump and look at limb symmetry in both of those tests effectively. And the summation of all of those bits and pieces would then inform our decision-making process, whether it's the right thing to do to put this athlete out to train on any given day, whether modification was required, or whether they were good to crack on and we were happy with small or moderate changes in their symptoms.
I'm sorry, but we're going to be here forever because I've got so many questions based on what you're saying. I'm going to kill your evening. So, blood flow restriction training. Let's have a little dive into that, seeing as though you've said it and it's been on my mind anyway.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the protocols that you would use to try to get try to improve a function going through that process that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, sure. So most of the research around using blood flow restriction training to relieve pain in different conditions of anterior knee pain in particular, they've used the common intervention that a lot of people would have heard about with blood flow restriction training, which is your 30-15-15-15 or a combination of failure sets. But effectively, they've been highly fatiguing, high load protocols with a reasonably high limb occlusion pressure. What we've just done at Edinburgh is gone through a little bit of an in-house trial where we've looked at using a low-load blood flow restriction training protocol to see if we could get the same changes in pain relief without impacting on muscle performance. So effectively what we did there was we tested our symptoms of, we used patellar tendon pain as our example. People get a little bit nervous when you start doing too much calf loading prior to a pitch session. So we used our athletes with either patellar tendinopathy or another form of anterior knee pain. They'd go through their normal morning monitoring protocol in combination with a pre-exercise counter movement jump. We'd then go through our blood flow restriction training protocol, which was 4 sets of 10 of a seated leg extension and a decline goblet squat. And we looked at a 3-second eccentric phase with a 1-second concentric phase using a 50% limb occlusion pressure, and a 2-minute rest with the cuffs off in between the exercises. And what we were able to show there was roughly a 45% reduction in the athlete's symptoms, and a 2 to 3% increase in counter movement jump performance. So those results aren't quite as large as the improvements that you see with a higher blood flow restriction training protocol. You tend to see up around 60 to 65%, but a really effective intervention nonetheless, and something that we were comfortable to incorporate as part of a pre-training strategy because we were confident that there wasn't going to be an impact on muscle performance.
Would you have any athletes that wouldn't respond to that BFI?
So there were a couple of things that we found, or I say we found, that were anecdotal within that study, is that, like I mentioned before, the impact of the intervention seemed to adhere to a dose-response relationship. So the harder it was, the more pain relief we seemed to get. So it became a little bit of a balancing act as to what our protocols for each of our athletes ended up being. And there also seemed to be a little bit of a process of diminishing returns. And so with some of our athletes who initially responded really well, they started to see less and less of effect as they went further into the process of the research trial. And so we trialed with those athletes switching the exercises effectively to increase the mechanical load just a little bit, and they started to respond really well again. And so purely anecdotal, but we did see a process of diminishing returns with our BFR protocols.
So another thing that you used was isometrics, you said, during that, then increased function during the warm-up phases before training. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, what that looked like?
So we used we experiment a little bit with each of our athletes, because, like I mentioned, the driver of pain in tendinopathy and is highly individualized. The combination of pathologies that each athlete is going to present to you with is always going to be a little bit different and a little bit unique, and so you need to trial a few different interventions, especially pre-training, to see what's going to give that athlete the most effective response. So we certainly found with some athletes that an isometric loading protocol was really effective. Others didn't respond well at all. So it was a bit of trial and error. We tended to start with Ebony Rio's protocol of 5 sets of 45 seconds on a really isolated exercise. So we'd start with a seated leg extension. We didn't look at testing or predicting one repetition max. We used RPE as our scale of intensity and looked to progress the athlete to be reporting a 7 out of 10 or greater on their RPE. And I think the important thing that we looked to do there was also track performance on that as an isolated exercise for that athlete, because essentially we want to change the function of the muscle, and we want to change the force generating potential of that muscle, and we need to continue to adapt their protocol as they get better at it. And so we did play around with different protocols to try and improve those qualities. We looked at the 30-second mark, which is what Keith sort of implement or indicated was where you'll look to see the greatest stress relaxation response, or the greatest bang for your buck with your stress relaxation response. But we'd also go down to as short as 15 seconds as a pre-training strategy to again try and give the athlete an opportunity to lift heavier weights and to progress their strength in that particular type of exercise.
So those players that responded to these interventions pre-training would train as per usual, or would there be modifications based on the impact of them pre-training activities?
It would be really individualized. So some of our backs, for example, who are a little bit more highly tuned and a little bit more sensitive to changes in pain, we'd be a little bit more receptive to them in how they were managed, and we'd be a little bit more responsive to their changes in symptoms. Some of our forwards who were just sort of keen to crack in and get on with it, we would be a little bit more accommodating there as well. So it was really an individual process to understand what changes in symptoms and what changes in function were problematic in that athlete, and what changes were, I guess, a warning sign for us that athlete was actually heading down a dangerous path, and intervention was going to become necessary rather than proactive. So that was really a process of being as individual as we can, and I think that's where the data collection processes at Edinburgh are really strong. We collect a lot of data and we collect it really regularly, and I think only when you do that does that process then become valuable, because you can understand with each individual what's important and what changes really do matter.
So when you say about the force plates being used to understand the function, if you didn't have force plates, like many practitioners out there won't, what would be your alternative?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think if I didn't have access to that level of diagnostic capability, I'd probably rely a lot more heavily on my changes in symptom to help inform my decision-making process, because like I mentioned, changes in tendon function can often be hidden within a kinetic chain, and you may not necessarily be able to visualize or quantify those changes if you don't have higher access to diagnostic capability. So I would probably look at relying a lot more heavily on my firstly whether they're presented with increases in symptom, and secondly whether or not those symptoms are responsive to exercise. That they'd become my two primary decision making diagnostics at that point.
So when you say about individualization, is that management of tendon very much, is it quite sporadic in terms of the individualization, or you can bucket athletes quite easily?
I mean, the more data that you collect on your athletes, the more you can anticipate trends, the more you can understand. If one of our second rowers has had 40 jumps over the course of the week, we expect he's going to be sore, and we can start to understand what type of response we're going to see from him. So once you have that data at your disposal, you can start to predict things a little bit, and you can start to proactively modify those athletes in the gym as you need to. But I think the fluidity of tendon management is really important, and you need to be able to recognize when to respond and how to respond, and sometimes the hardest thing is to proactively rest an athlete. But if you're confident that it's the right thing to do, and you've got the diagnostics and the data to support your decision, then it can be the right thing to do.
So we're just going to take a very quick break in the chat with Luke. I hope you enjoyed part 1. So over in part 2, we have a little bit more of a chat around blood flow restriction training and the place that it takes in the rehab process for Luke when he was at Edinburgh, but also what he will take forward into his new role at the Melbourne Rebels. We also have a little chat around benchmarking and creating appropriate benchmarks during the rehab process. So again, if you're interested or have any involvement in the rehab process at your organisation, this part 2 is definitely for you. This episode of the Pacey Performance Podcast is sponsored by Black Box Fitness. Black Box Fitness are leaders in performance training equipment and facility design. Black Box are specialists in designing and building performance facilities for sports teams and strength and conditioning coaches. Black Box manufacture and distribute a full range of strength training equipment from their headquarters in Belfast right across Europe. If you want to learn more about Black Box, check out their website blackboxfitness.com or follow them on social media at blackboxfitness. And this episode is also sponsored by Kitman Labs. Kitman Labs is sport's first technology company to offer a complete solution that includes innovative analytics and an advanced athlete management platform that is supported by a team of sports, technology, and data science experts with over 200 years' experience. Kitman Labs is leading the evolution of sports performance, partnering with over 150 elite teams across the NFL, NHL, MLB, AFL, EPL, and Championship Rugby. Through advanced statistical analysis, rigorous scientific research, and unparalleled industry experience, they've architected the world's only analytics platform that helps sports teams to truly harness their data and uncover the influences behind performance optimization and injury risk. To find out more about Kitman Labs, visit kitmanlabs.com or follow them on social media at Kitman Labs. And this episode is also sponsored by Setanta College. Setanta College, led by Dr. Liam Hennessy, provides international recognised qualifications in strength and conditioning and performance science from certificate to master's level. Courses are designed by industry leaders such as Des Ryan and Professor Ian Jeffries, ensuring students and graduates are at the cutting edge of technology and learning the most current methodologies from world-renowned practitioners. Setanta College's unique blended learning approach allows you to take the next step in your career in your own time and at your own pace. Lectures are delivered in an online classroom, while residential workshops provide the perfect opportunity for practical application of your studies with guidance from experts within the field of sports science and performance coaching. With campus locations across Ireland, the UK, USA, India, and South Africa, applications are now open for courses including the BSc in Strength and Conditioning, MSc in Performance Coaching, and MSc in Applied Sport and Exercise Physiology. Visit setantacollege.com for more information on how to apply. And now back to the interview with Luke. I'd like to dive back into the blood flow restriction training side of things and move away from the tendon stuff, but BFR within a rehab setting itself. Mm-hmm. Now, there's different tech out there. There's obviously Valve have got their cuffs. You've got Hytro who have got the t-shirts and everything built in. So these solutions are becoming more popular and making it more able to be implemented across larger groups, when pre-traditionally it was maybe a rehab tool because of the barriers for the tech that was there. But I'd just like to get your take on implementing BFR with larger groups, and just why you would go down the blood flow restriction route in a general rehab setting.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little preface there. I'm actually slightly involved with a blood flow restriction training company called Suji BFR, who have developed their own cuff, which is so I've given my little plug there, and definitely the best cuffs on the. Sorry, go ahead.
What is it, Luke? What's it called?
Suji BFR. But to answer your question, this new tech is making BFR far more implementable in your wider squads as you need to and as you see fit, and there's lots of different ways that you can implement it into your program. That the primary ways that we would use the tech at Edinburgh was part of a wider warm-up strategy, and what the tech enabled us to do was effectively lay out the Suji cuffs on the table at the start of the morning, and the players would filter through like they would as part of any other injury or training prep program. They'd grab the cuffs and they'd grab their iPads and they'd crack on, and I no longer had to manage that. I no longer had to oversee any of the BFR work. I'd check in with their exercise prescription and their programs as I would any other athlete. But the level of tech allowed that to be really athlete-led and self-managed. Likewise, we had one of our athletes who through injury history was contraindicated to high volumes of heavy resistance training throughout the course of a rugby season, and particularly while his training loads were high. And so we'd use blood flow restriction training in that instance to try and make sure that we were still able to provide him with a hypertrophy stimulus that wasn't going to provoke his symptoms. And again, I didn't need to oversee him. I didn't need to help him set the kit up every day. He knew that post training he'd come in and he'd grab the cuffs. He actually ended up buying his own cuffs, and he'd come into the gym and he'd crack on. So the tech's there. Athletes are far more tech savvy and have more time on their hands to learn about it than we do, and so you're really limited by your own imagination. Really, we've just started a master's research project with Glasgow City FC, who are looking at using it as a training adjunct for their players, where they're looking at markers of calf muscle function, hamstring muscle function, in a BFR group and in a traditional resistance training group. So that they're using it on a much larger group scale, and it'll be really interesting to see what their results show us in a female team-based sport.
Is that your little boy in the background?
Yeah, sorry, mate. He's waving away. He's fine. He'll be fine.
Good. So, in terms of protocols for BFI, would it be similar usage to your pre-training, your 30-15-15-15?
So it's a really interesting question, and something that I'm quite passionate about exploring. My understanding of where the research sits at the moment is a recommended BFR protocol, and this is the most effective BFR protocol, doesn't necessarily exist. And from my experience, blood flow restriction training, it behaves and should behave like any other form of strength training, and adheres to the same principles, and so you should program accordingly. So to give you an example there, blood flow restriction training, to my understanding, will adhere to the said principle of a specific adaptation to an imposed demand. And so if you're looking at implementing blood flow restriction training to improve muscle hypertrophy, then you're going to be looking at progressing the components of the training program that will elicit your metabolic stress response, and that will change your mechanical loading to the tissue, because they're the two components that are going to drive muscle hypertrophy. So you'll look to increase the metabolic stress. You might increase the limb occlusion pressure and progress that variable to change the level of mechanical load. You might look at changing the exercise from a double leg to a single leg movement or something along those lines. Alternatively, if you're looking to use blood flow restriction training to improve muscle strength, then you'd probably use a different protocol, because you're going to want to focus your aims primarily on changing mechanical load, because to develop strength, that there is no substitute for mechanical load. And so you'd probably look at keeping your occlusion pressure to what we know and what we think is the minimum effective dose, which is between 40 and 50%. You'd keep that as your constant, and you'd look to progress variables that will allow you to increase mechanical load. So I think what your program is effectively stick to the principles that you know, and stick to. It will also adhere to diminishing returns and progressive overload, and so go stick with your normal S&C principles that you'd adhere to any other form of exercise prescription, and they'll set you in good stead when you're implementing a blood flow restriction protocol.
So you've kind of mentioned hypertrophy and strength, but is there any improvements that can be gained from BFR with more general athleticism, speed, jumps, etc.?
Potentially. So I know Chris Gaviglio has published a paper a little while ago looking at the use of blood flow restriction training as an alternative strategy to improve counter movement jump performance. There's little bits around, or there's an ongoing debate around the potential for blood flow restriction training to enhance the recruitment of fast twitch muscle fibers, and I guess the concept of ischemic preconditioning using similar tech is an area of interest as well. In terms of long-term training strategies to improve those athletic qualities, I think you would see improvements in those qualities through changing muscle hypertrophy, or by improving muscle hypertrophy and muscle strength, and some of the qualities that underlie the development of speed and athletic performance in that regard. I don't think there's enough of a research backing at the moment to be able to say with any confidence that this is an intervention and a protocol that you should use if you want to use blood flow restriction training to increase speed.
Is there anyone that you wouldn't use BFR with? Any examples that you can give us?
I'm actually... So a massive, I guess, an area of interest for me is also the use of blood flow restriction training in clinical populations, and it's been shown to be really effective in conditions of osteoporosis. We've used it in athletes with Crohn's disease, polymyositis, dermatomyositis, lots and lots of different conditions, and sarcopenia, for example, that blood flow restriction training is being used in, and even end-stage kidney disease and individuals with hypertension are now being shown to be viable candidates for blood flow restriction training. And I guess my point there is that if it's suitable and can be used with these guys, that there's not many that would fit into an elite athlete population that I'd be uncomfortable in using it with. There is a little bit of apprehension, particularly within the medical teams, that blood flow restriction training may interfere with fluid dynamics in athletes with a joint effusion. So we're a little bit apprehensive about using it in those scenarios. But some of the research from Luke Hughes' research group in ACL reconstruction have shown that, or have demonstrated that there was no effect on the blood flow restriction protocol that they used on joint effusion in the long-term management of an ACL rehabilitation. So to be honest, I don't have any massive apprehensions around using it with any particular population, but would just adhere to caution and look at monitoring the potential for any adverse effects of the protocol.
So you had your little plug with Tsuji BFR. What makes that tech different to anything else that's out there? Took the ball.
No, completely fine. So basically, the Tsuji tech is probably comparable to the Valve device, the Airband, as to what it offers the user in terms of being able to bespoke and personalize the occlusion pressure to that individual. I guess what the Tsuji device offers that's a little bit different is the Tsuji device offers an app-based system that allows users to effectively be guided through the blood flow restriction training process, and what that involves is effectively them choosing from muscle strength oriented programs, muscle hypertrophy oriented programs, strength endurance, or if they want to use it as a pain mitigation tool, what are going to be the most effective programs and the most effective exercise progressions, and they try to then tailor those programs to the individual's current state, and that will be based off both self-reported physical performance and also measures of RPE and measures of fatigue along the way.
Cool. Happy days. Right, I'm going to give us 15 minutes And I'd like to dive into a bit of an additional point to what we started off with in terms of the specific rehab role, because there'll be plenty of people out there who are still the S&C coach who does everything. They're doing the rehab, they're doing the sports science side of things, doing the strength and power stuff, and I'd like to give a bit of information for them guys from your point of view and planning the rehab process from start to finish. So, athlete gets injured. What is your first port of call when you're planning the next 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 months, 9 months, depending on the injury? Where's your head at?
First of all, my head's at working with the medical team to make sure that we've got the diagnosis right. And I know that sounds like a really simple place and perhaps an obvious place to start, but it often gets overlooked, not in terms of necessarily a misdiagnosis, but as an S&C coach, making sure you understand and that you've got all the information that you need in order to start that rehab process with your medical team. So I'm a big believer in a rehabilitation setting that structure dictates function and that you should plan your rehabilitation accordingly. So, for example, within the hamstring, you've got 3 different hamstring muscles that all have a different anatomy, all have a different role to play in sprint mechanics and or acceleration. So you need to understand where the tear is, which hamstring is it in, whereabouts within that hamstring is the tear, and then the severity of it. And until you have all that information available to you, you don't have all the information you need to write a really effective program. So the first things I'll be considering are what's our diagnosis, what's our predicted time frame for return, and then also having a really good understanding of what the risk factors are for this athlete. So that will consider the mechanism of injury, and then also that athlete's longer standing injury history, because they're the things that you're going to need to understand when you're looking at mitigating the risk for further injury, and planning a successful rehabilitation. And then I think you can, once you have that information available to you, then you can start filling in the blanks around your stage-based return, what your criteria are going to need to be in order for that athlete to progress from stage to stage. And I think the last thing that you need to think about is which exercises you're going to prescribe.
So, planning it into phases, how do you decide on what is the criteria to pass to then move on to the next stage? Does that differ obviously differs based on injury, but how do you pinpoint that is what we need to pass to progress?
So we'll try and understand effectively working back from or starting with the end in mind, if you like. So what are our higher end diagnostics going to be in order for that athlete to return to play? And then once we understand those things, we can then develop a systematic process of trying to progress them to that stage. So, for example, if we look at a calf muscle injury, because that's a really pertinent injury at the moment and something that's taking over professional team sport and taking the mantle from hamstring injuries, first and foremost, we need to understand, if we start at the beginning, we need to understand that the calf muscle, the contractile elements are functioning appropriately and that they've returned to a basic level of function, and we need to understand that range of movement has come back so we can start to load that athlete appropriately. Before we'd run them, we'd then start to look at whether the peak force generating capacity of that muscle has returned, because we know with the calf muscle, even running at slow speeds, that soleus in particular is subjected to really high forces. So we need to know that the peak force generating capacity of that tissue has returned to pre-exercise levels. Once they've started that return to running and they're starting to progress to more intensive field-based activities and starting to specialize back into sport-specific training, we need to know that physical qualities like rate of force development and muscle tendon unit stiffness and those bits and pieces have returned and ideally improved, and we can gain confidence that those metrics have returned. We then also need to consider our loading progressions as well, and how long it takes that athlete to accumulate enough exposures to running, to high speed running, to accelerations, to change of directions, and have an appropriate loading plan in place as well.
So one thing you said at the start was calves taking over hamstring injuries most prevalent in sport. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so we actually had quite a good conversation about this with Nick Lumley, and there's some really great research coming out from a group that have called themselves the Calf Project, which is Rob Whiteley and Seth O'Neill's group out at Aspetar, and from what we can understand, effectively, when we look at load management principles in professional team sport, when we see either a spike in training intensity or a spike in our training loads, our initial reaction is to reduce the intensity of training, because we know that that a spike in training load, whether you're using an acute chronic work ratio or an exponentially weighted moving average, whichever metric you choose to use, we try and reduce the intensity of training because that's going to minimize our risk of hamstring injury, which has been our primary cause of soft tissue injury over the past 10 years, and it's probably going to alleviate the stress on your groin and on your rec fem as well, some of your other major soft tissue injuries. What it doesn't do, reducing the intensity of training rather, it doesn't change the load that goes through your calf, because we know from some of the work out of here in Melbourne, we know that even at slow running speeds, the calf muscle is still working incredibly hard and is still subjected to really high ground reaction forces. And actually, as you progress intensity, we don't see the massive spike in load through that structure that we do in other soft tissues. And so I think a lot of our focus has been on managing hamstring risk, managing groin and adductor risk, that we haven't really developed effective strategies at managing our calves. And I think the other thing is, when you tend to reduce the intensity, you might reduce the size of your playing field and inadvertently increase change of direction and acceleration tasks, which we know the role of the soleus is so diverse and wide ranging around the ankle and the knee that it has a massive role in those things and in those high force tasks. We also don't know a lot about what are our diagnostics that inform our calf management strategy. So we're starting to learn that an effective seated plantar flexion test or seated isometric plantar flexion test can be a really useful diagnostic to identify those at risk of calf injury. But that level of research is still really in its infancy, and we don't know enough about that yet to be able to be really prescriptive with our exercise.
So how did you guys at Edinburgh manage your calf loading?
Yeah, so, I mean, I hope Nick doesn't mind me saying, but the evidence would suggest not particularly well.
Okay.
And like most clubs around Europe in particular, and from the RFU data and from the level of effort and resource that the IRFU are going through to get on top of things, we know that this problem is not new to anyone, and it's not something that one club in particular is dealing with. It's something that everyone's struggling with, and I think, I mean, it's a conversation for another day, but I think COVID's also changed the rules about training load management, and that's thrown us all into a bit of a tiz. And so yeah, to be honest, not particularly well, but I do believe that the processes and the structures and the reviews that we've gone through have highlighted new strategies that will be implemented up there without me there, and I hope that will set the club in good stead moving forward.
Would you tackle that differently? I know, probably going back a few years now, but would you tackle that differently in different sports? And if so, what would change?
Potentially. I mean, I think when you're managing soft tissue risk, or doing your best to manage soft tissue risk, because that's effectively all any of us are doing, we're doing everything that we can. I think you just need to understand what are the primary risk factors of your sport, and that comes down to having a really, really good and really robust injury surveillance system, so you effectively know what your problems are, and understanding the risk factors of your sport. So for example, in rugby union, I'm actually not a big advocate for really, I guess, in-depth use of GPS in rugby union. And that's not to say I don't believe it has its place. I absolutely do, and I would certainly use it extensively. But understanding its limitations, because a lot of the risk factors from rugby union come from static exertions, and those you can't possibly quantify the intensity of rugby union currently through a GPS device, and so you need to understand within each of your sports what are your primary risk factors, if and how are you going to quantify them, and what are your primary injuries that you're trying to deal with and that you're trying to understand.
Lovely. Well, I'm conscious that I'm taking up some of your evening, and there's a little boy in there who probably wants his dad. But where can people get in touch with you, Luke, and have a little chat about what you've got going on in the Rebels or anything that we've just discussed?
To be honest, I'm not that active on social media. I can be. Yeah, no, it's not really for me. But I will certainly receive anything through Twitter or LinkedIn. I do tend to use LinkedIn quite a little bit to network. My email address at the Rebels, I imagine, will be quite easy to find, and more than happy for people to reach out via any of those platforms, and I'll certainly respond to everyone, and happy to chat more and try and learn more.
Superb. Well, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for fitting me into a very busy schedule that you've got coming up, especially with the move over back home. And really appreciate it. And I'll chat to you soon, mate.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Rob.
Cheers, Luke. Thanks for tuning in to episode 357 of the Pacey Performance Podcast. Firstly, big thanks to you for giving up your time to tune into the podcast and have a little listen to my conversation with Luke. Obviously, huge thanks to Luke for giving up his time. I think only a couple of days into his new role at the Melbourne Rebels, so really appreciate him carving out some time in his very busy diary. Also, big thanks to Hawking Dynamics, to iMeasureU, Black Box Fitness, Kitman Labs, and Setanta College for sponsoring this episode today. The podcast could not run its current form without these guys, so I always do appreciate their support. So if you haven't pressed subscribe on your chosen podcast player, make sure you do now, and I will look forward to chatting to you next week.